Welcome to an interview with the Reverend Dr. Jarold K. Zeman. Dr. Zeman comes from Czechoslovakia, and so on this December the 5th, 1995, it's the eve of St. Nicholas Day, and St. Nicholas is the patron saint of Czechoslovakia, so perhaps, Dr. Zeman, all of those things fit in very well. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about yourself, and why don't you tell us about your early origins, and we'll take a look at your life before you came to Canada.
Perhaps I should note that as I approach my 70th birthday early next year, I can look back to three very distinct periods in my life. The first 22 years spent in Czechoslovakia, years of my formation, childhood and education. Then for 20 years I lived in Ontario, in Toronto mostly, and then since '68 here in Wolfville. And each of those periods had its own different characteristics. By the way, the patron saint of Czechoslovakia, of the Czech people, is Saint Wenceslas, not Saint Nicholas.
Oh.
Saint Nick belongs to the Dutch people. Well, I'd like to say something about the context in which my childhood and youth and years as a student were spent. I grew up in a very happy political context of the pre-war Czechoslovakia, which was a model Western democracy until Hitler appeared on the scene, which means up to the Treaty of Munich in 1938. I lived in a country, in a village. My father was a teacher, and I'll say a bit more about that later. But then the clouds gathered, and Hitler first succeeded in occupying, tearing away the borderlands where German-speaking population lived, the Sudetenland, in the fall of '38. And then in March '39, I can still remember that day. It was a snowy morning. The German tanks and military vehicles rolled in. We lived right along one of the main access highways from Germany to Prague. So that signaled 7 years of occupation, so-called protectorate, '39 to '45. Then came the liberation, mostly by the Russian, the Red Army, in our part, and followed by 3 years, '45 to '48, when we tried to be a bridge between the West and the East. I was a university student in Prague during those years, and it was a marvelous time, a time of great cultural renaissance, an opportunity to grow. So unfortunately it didn't last, and in February '48 the communists arranged a coup d'etat and seized power and began gradually to tighten the screws. And I was one of the several thousand fortunate ones that were able to get out. I went out legally as a scholarship student to Toronto. And so September '48 marked the end of this first period in my life. Obviously, our roots can never be cut, and what follows after that comes out of those roots. So I look back and praise God for the influence of my home. It was a happy home. My father was a teacher at the elementary school level, and also very active in the Presbyterian church. We lived next door to the church building, and the manse was on the other side. So he was the organist and choir leader. So we lived sort of under the shadow of the Protestant church. On the other side, on the other end of the village, however, was a Roman Catholic church. And on my mother's side, the family came from a Roman Catholic tradition, and my grandmother or grandparents who lived there remained Roman Catholic. And so I was exposed right from the earliest childhood to this conflict of traditions Protestant and Catholic, and my grandmother, who was a very devout Catholic with pictures of saints on every wall and a wonderful influence on me, she of course was very sympathetic to have the heretical boy come under her influence. And I was obviously influenced by the church. I'll say a bit more about that later. And in terms of formal education, the arrangement in European countries used to be that school systems were divided by confessions, and so there used to be a Roman Catholic school system and a Protestant school system. And therefore in our village there were two school buildings, and the teachers lived right in the school building. So we lived in the Protestant school building. By that time the school systems had been merged, but nevertheless the relic, so to say, continued. So in one half of the building was an apartment where I grew up, and the other half was one large classroom where the usual attendance was around 60 in those days. And I went the first 2 years of elementary school to my father's class. I actually started sneaking in from about age 4, hiding under the benches and then being ushered out. So it's a small surprise, I guess, that I have ended up as a teacher. It was in the blood, it was in the genes. And after that elementary school of 5 years, I walked, literally, or biked, for 7 years to what would be pronounced here gymnasium. That is a classical high school. And very heavy on languages, German, 6 years of Latin, 4 years of French, 2 years of English, a lot of literature, history, but also sciences. Then the last year of high school, the Germans took us out, and I was sent into a factory where we were repairing German jets that had been shot down by the Allies. I'm pretty sure none of them could fly again after we fixed them. And that was, of course, then we finished the high school quickly after the end of the war, and I went to university in Prague. So Prague was a marvelous city, something probably what it is again today. And as I was studying at the philosophical faculty, I wanted to be a college teacher, studying philosophy and English. I would be out almost every evening, lectures in related fields, to opera, symphony concerts. I was simply imbibing, taking in the fullness of the cultural life of the city. It was marvelous. The East was meeting the West, and we had visitors from Moscow and from London and Washington. It was a great cultural enrichment for 3 years.
Dr. Zeman, in 1948, when the communists took over, how did you come to leave, and why Canada?
Well, I don't think I mentioned before that during my 3 years at university, after the first year, which was at the philosophical faculty, and I studied mainly modern philosophy, well, all of philosophy and the English language, I began to doubt seriously many of the convictions that I had developed earlier. And in the midst, this is strange, in the midst of that period of doubting, I heard an irresistible call into ministry, which I was fighting off for several months, but finally gave in. And in the fall of 46, I transferred from the philosophical faculty to the theological faculty, preparing for Presbyterian ministry. And after 2 years, that is now in the spring of 48, the Presbyterian Church in Canada offered 4 scholarships to students from Czechoslovakia. This was part of the reconstruction program after the Second World War. And because my English was reasonably in good shape, and I was at the stage when I could go and complete my training here, so I was one of the 4 fortunate ones. So we got out legally and arrived at Knox College in Toronto, and I completed my theological training there. I was to go back, and the last few months in 49, were probably the most difficult years in my life in terms of decision making, because I faced two decisions. One was whether to go back where some of my colleagues from the student days were already under interrogation by the communist police, or whether to stay in Canada with all the implications. And secondly, I faced another decision which was equally taxing, and that is whether to remain Presbyterian or become a Baptist. And I don't want to enlarge on that right now. I'll do that a little later. And after weeks of wrestling with both and confiding in some of the faculty members, I said yes to both and decided to stay in Canada, become a Canadian, and also to become a Baptist. So that was the big transition in my life.
Could I ask a question about your family that you left behind?
Yeah.
Do you still have family in Czechoslovakia? What about your mother and father and their lifespans?
Well, my father lived to a ripe age of 89. I'm not sure that I would like to live that long. My mother died, on the other hand, quite young, at 55. I never saw my mother again. And I saw my father twice when he came to visit us in Canada much later. My brother also died relatively young. I had only one brother, no sister. So I have no immediate family in the old country except cousins, uncles, and so on. So I have been through the rules of communist control, through the years of communist control. I have been cut off almost thoroughly. And now the doors are open, and my wife's widow is there, but we have not yet visited Prague.
In terms of your own involvement in the church in Canada, you then not only became a Baptist, but you became a Baptist pastor.
Well, I was training for ministry, which can take many forms, and there was great need for ministry among immigrants of my own background in Toronto. This was the time when refugees were being received into Canada quite openly, and practically every week there would be trains bringing them from Quebec or Montreal to the sort of internment camps east of Toronto. And there was a Czech-speaking Baptist church in Toronto with a pastor who was about to leave. And here I was, a young fellow with promising gifts and musically gifted, who could lead the choir and accompany singing. So they drafted me. So I spent the first 6 years as pastor of the, as it was called, Czechoslovak Baptist Church. It was mainly Czech and Slovak are related languages. It was a time of intensive evangelism, because the majority of Czechs were either agnostics, nothing, or they were nominal Catholics. And we were trying to reach them, giving them copies of New Testament and tracts. But it was also a time of vast and varied social work. In fact, at one point we changed our Sunday school rooms into a hostel for unemployed immigrants. And they lived in the same church building with us, and we fed them in the church kitchen. And I developed connections with different employers to find them jobs. It was quite an initiation into the whole spectrum of ministries. And after the 6 years, I went into a second pastorate near Hamilton and Brantford, Villanova, which was a rural church, basically English-speaking, but quite a few immigrants in the area. So I spent 10 years in pastoral ministry, one in the city, one in the country. And then the Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec, through Dr. Dixon Burns, who was the superintendent of the Home Mission Board, invited me to become one of the secretaries in the Home Mission Board. Initially I declined. I didn't feel qualified enough, but then I changed my mind, and I spent from 59 to 68, another decade almost, working for the Baptist Convention with changing portfolios. Initially, I directed the work among immigrants in many languages as the convention head work. I think at one point we had 12 different languages being used. Then social work, evangelism, chaplaincies in penal institutions, the whole gamut. And eventually I became the successor to Dr. Burns as the main secretary with 3 other staff persons of home missions. So that was quite a training, and I was, of course, visiting churches all over the convention and beyond. So it gave me an understanding and experience of the mainstream of Canadian Baptist life, for which I am eternally grateful.
I wonder if we could back up just a stage and talk a little bit more specifically about your spiritual pilgrimage, how you came to know the Lord, and where that led in terms of your own personal relationship to God.
Well, I think that's the golden thread through my life, and I would have returned to it regardless of your question. Well, I had, I think, very happy human upbringing by my parents. My mother was originally Catholic, but when she married my Presbyterian father, she left the Catholic Church, but really didn't go to any church all my childhood. And yet she was a marvelous mother whose love was poured into my life. She helped me during my high school studies and all the rest. Father, very active in the church, very active in a lot of other organizations, so he really didn't have a great share in my upbringing, except sort of at a distance. Anyway, I grew up in the context of the Presbyterian Church and was confirmed in due course. The Presbyterian confirmation, at least in Europe, is different from the Anglican one. It's not a sacrament. It's basically catechism and Bible teaching for a whole year. We took classes for 1 afternoon a week from the minister, and I took it very seriously and learned a lot of the Bible. And then there was the Confirmation Sunday when we were examined publicly. Can you imagine this being done in Canada? You have a group, about 25 young people in their mid-teens. I was 13. And they sit in a circle at the front of the church, and the minister asks questions and points his finger at anybody to answer those questions. And on the basis of that examination, that we knew what the faith was about and what the Bible was about, then we repeated the Apostles' Creed, and that was our profession of faith. And we were given the right hand of fellowship into the church and admitted to the communion table for the first time. Now, the tragedy of it was that while I had a lot of religion in my head, then nothing has changed in my heart, and I knew that, and I think the minister knew that. We received a copy of the Bible, Czech Bible, and each was inscribed with some Bible verse by the minister, and mine was Psalm 119, verse 94 in King James, "I am thine, preserve me or keep me." That verse has haunted me, so to say, and comforted me through every crisis and all the years ever since. It has been the sort of foundation for my spiritual life. I am not my own. God has chosen me long before I was born, and I rest in that security, obviously in the Reformed tradition. But that was head religion, and it was only 2 years later that, sort of out of nowhere, the only thing I can recall is that somehow a tract of some interdenominational society got into my hand, which was contrasting the real Christians from the nominal Christians. Who are the real Christians who experience new birth and so on, and who are the nominal Christians? That might have had some impact, but I started to read John's Gospel, and I came under deep conviction of sin. And then, of course, took those verses in John, like John 1:12, "As many as received him, to them gives he the power to become the children of God," and the chapter 3. So I just took hold of those verses and experienced a real new birth and became a religious fanatic. My parents were worried because I was distributing tracts in the high school. And you wouldn't believe that I'm sending it to all relatives and friends, trying to convert everybody. And I succeeded everywhere with these evangelistic witnessing, except in our church. One Sunday morning, I placed tracts on every pew. And before the service would begin, the sexton came in and collected them. And after the service, I was called before the board of elders and the minister and rebuked that I am acting as a hypocrite, thinking that I am living at a higher spiritual level than they are. Well, they didn't dismiss me from membership, knowing who my father was, but it was quite a lesson, repeating the sort of lessons of the early apostles in the, in the books of the apostles. And that conversion experience, through the reading of the Bible, has, I think, pretty well fixed my main line of commitment for the rest of life. Were you asking about the call into ministry? No.
Well, that seems the natural place to go from there, because in the midst of your life, you described how you've had the conversion experience, then you went and began to study philosophy and were filled with doubt, and in the midst of that, a call came. So how can you be doubting what you have so intensely believed and at the same time feel called in ministry?
Well, as long as I was at home, even though it was in the middle of the Second War, this was 1941, age 15, when I was converted, and that was the darkest time of the Second War, just a few weeks before the Soviet Union entered, or before Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and Britain had been alone, left alone, to very dark days, and only now I am understanding how much Canadians have sacrificed during those early years of the Second War before the Americans got into the act. So I obviously understood clearly that conversion automatically leads to ministry. Nobody needs to tell me that. I mean, I read the books of Acts, and so as long as you become follower of Christ and the Holy Spirit fills you, so you begin to witness. And so I was in the ministry. And I believe that the lay ministry is far more important than the ordained ministry. In the context of European society, which was so secularized, we're just barely approaching that stage here, where the majority of people didn't go to churches. They didn't know the basics. If a minister would bear witness, well, they would dismiss it. He was paid to talk religion, after all. But if a layperson, a fellow laborer in the factory or in the office, would bear witness to what Christ means to him or her, that counted. And I understood that, and I also knew that in Paul's letters there's a clear teaching that God bestows special equipment, gifts, on every member of the church for teaching, for administering, for admonishing, and so on. And so my ideal of ministry was to be a layperson. That's why I went to the philosophical faculty. I wanted to be a teacher, influence young people, college students. But I guess God had other plans. In fact, the wife of the minister who christened me way back many years earlier, my mother told me that when she looked at me as a baby in the cradle, she said, "He will be a preacher." Well, and there is a sequence to that. I suffered a lot of sickness as a child. I almost died as a baby from pneumonia, and then at age 12, I was pretty well gone from diphtheria, against which there weren't enough medications. The doctors gave up. And my parents and the Presbyterian minister spent a night praying that God would deliver me, and he did. And they made a pledge of my life to his service. They never told me, wisely, so that if I would hear the call, it would come from God and not through the wishes of the parents. In fact, they weren't very happy when I told them after the first year of university that I would switch to theology and become a minister, because of the European context. The ministers were paid poorly, they were looked down upon, and all the rest in our society. So the call came I believe, straight from God. It was a conviction. And no doubt, of course, behind it was the upbringing and the influence of the two Presbyterian ministers under whom I grew up, both of whom were exceptional men who spoke several languages, had studied abroad, and great preachers. So I owe a lot to the Presbyterian tradition, in spite of having left it.
You've told us about your family in Czechoslovakia and you're coming to Canada, but very obviously you have another family with Canadian roots as you've settled in. Tell us a little bit about your
Yes, I never intended to be a monk or remain celibate. And again, just as God led me, it's amazing how, when I look back, how God kept opening and closing doors. And in that book where I have collected a few of my articles and which I called Open Doors, I think that indicates, including the quotations from Paul's epistles, how God opens doors. Well, that's true of my marriage. During the year of studies at Knox College in Toronto, there was a SCM, Student Christian Movement Conference, in Winnipeg during the Christmas break. And the students and faculty at Knox were generous, and they said it would be good for a European student to see other parts of Canada and have an exposure to a larger group of young people. These were not just theological students, but university students. So they paid my trip to Winnipeg to this conference. And I knew that there were Czech settlements of immigrants in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba, you know, the ethnic settlements in the West. And so after the conference finished, before I took the train back, I went to Saskatchewan to a community called Esterházy, which was half Hungarian, half Czech. And I preached there in Czech for them and visited many homes. I was there about 3 days. And one of the homes I visited was where my future wife was only a mid-teenager, high school student. And she often remarks with a twinkle in her eye that her father asked me to come and visit them, and the mother always regretted that he did because I took the oldest daughter. So after she graduated from high school, she came to Toronto and studied at Victoria University. And we, of course, continued our courtship and were married. And God blessed us with 4 children. They're all scattered. And strangely enough, this is some sort of apostolic succession. My dad was a teacher. Both my wife had teacher's training, and of course I ended up as a teacher. And 3 of our 4 children are teachers. One in Alberta, one in Toronto, and one is a university professor of psychology in the state of Maine. And only one daughter is in Pictou, working as a secretary in the Michelin Company. And we now have 7 grandchildren, so the Zeman clan is spreading.
Well, Dr. Zeman, thank you very much for sharing with us about your early life and your family, and we look forward to the next installment when we can take a look at some of the things that have happened to you in your life in Canada. Thank you for being with us.